So we welcome His Excellency President of Iceland, Gudni Johannesona. Your Excellency President Gudni Johannesona, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests. This week is very important and very significant for us, all of us. This Sunday, on November 18, we are making the 100th anniversary of the proclamation of Republic of Latvia. Latvia celebrates 100 years since it became an independent state. Today, it's a great honor and privilege to us, for all of us here at the University of Latvia, to welcome very significant and important guest, President of the Republic of Iceland, His Excellency Mr. Gudni Johannesona. Iceland was the first of foreign states to recognize the restoration of Latvia's independence on 22nd August 1991. Before taking office as a president, Mr. Johannesona was professor of history at the University of Iceland. For a few years, he also worked part-time for the Icelandic State Broadcasting Company as a reporter. The President has written numerous books, scholarly and newspaper articles. The President of Iceland is the country's head of state and the only representative chosen by the entire electorate in a direct elections. And now, let us welcome to the podium His Excellency, President of the Republic of Iceland, for a speech, Can Small States Make a Difference? Iceland's Support for Baltic Independence 1990-1991. Please, Mr. President, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Rector, Excellencies, dear guests, this is a great honor. It is an honor to be here in Latvia as the people of Latvia celebrate their 100th anniversary. But let me tell you one thing. Today is also an important day for Iceland. Today is the day of the Icelandic language, Dagur íslenskrar tungu. Today we celebrate the importance of Icelandic for our community, for our national identity. And this leads me to the first connection, almost, we can make between Iceland and these shores here, the shores of the Baltic. So, the Icelandic language, our source of pride, is our national treasure, the Icelandic sagas, stories written in the 12th to 14th centuries or so about Icelandic chieftains, Icelandic families, Icelandic voyagers, and Icelandic Vikings. One of the Vikings was a man named Egill. Icelandic names are hard to pronounce, I know. Egill. In the saga of Egill, it is recounted how he, with his friend Þórólfur, went on a visit to the Baltic. So let me read you a part of the saga of Egill. In the spring, Þórólf and Egill equipped a big longship and took on a crew to go raiding in the Baltic that summer. They won a huge amount of booty and fought many battles there. And the same summer, they also went to Kurland, where they lay offshore for a while. They offered the people there a fortnight's truce and traded with them. And when the truce was over, they began plundering again. So this is our first connection. I am not come here to plunder. Let me emphasize that. Those days are long gone. But this is the first connection between Iceland, because Egill lived and died in Iceland, and this part of the world. We are here to celebrate, we Icelanders, my company, we are here to celebrate 100 years since the declaration of the independence of Latvia. This same year, 1918, Iceland also reached a milestone in its history. On the 1st of December, 1918, Iceland became a free and sovereign state. Yes, we were still in a royal union with Denmark. The Danish king remained the sovereign, and we had the Danes handling our foreign affairs, but we were a free and sovereign state. So in that sense, for instance, in the early 1920s, Iceland formally recognized the independence of the three newly independent Baltic countries, Latvia and your neighbors Estonia and Lithuania. Now, in the 1930s, our paths diverged. Democratic rule survived in Iceland, but not here in Latvia. And then, of course, the big watershed came during the Second World War. In April 1940, Nazi forces invaded Denmark. And remember, Iceland was in a royal union with Denmark, and the Danes handled our foreign affairs. And now they were occupied. So overnight, the Icelandic parliament resolved that immediately Iceland would assume all sovereign powers and foreign policy as well. No longer this relationship with Denmark. In May, the following month, Iceland was occupied. The anecdote goes like this. One of the ministers in the Icelandic government was awoken in the middle of the night and told, "Sir, there are planes flying about around Reykjavik." And he replied, "Can you see where they're from? Are they German? Are they British?" And the reply he got was, "They are British." And then the minister said, "Okay, then I'll just go to sleep again." This was a friendly occupation. Of course, Iceland formally protested, and it's never a positive thing to be occupied by a foreign power. But during the Second World War, occupation by Britain was vastly different, on a totally different level, than occupation by the Axis powers. So, the following month, on the 17th of June, 1940, Soviet forces invaded Latvia. 17th of June. Keep that date in mind, because this date is the birthday of Jón Sigurðsson, the leader of Iceland's independence struggle in the 19th century. Now, remember with me that the Icelandic independence struggle was not a violent conflict. Nobody died in the Icelandic struggle for independence. It was fought with the pen rather than the sword. But the leader was this intellectual, Jón Sigurðsson, born on the 17th of June, 1940. And this day was warm in the minds and hearts of Icelanders, almost like Independence Day. So on the 17th of June, 1940, as Soviet forces were invading Latvia, a local newspaper in Reykjavik recalled the plight of small states by these words: "Many small nations suffer more than we do now. We must wish that they will enjoy freedom and liberty again after the horrors of the war that is now raging." So that was the 17th of June, 1940, and the 17th of June, 1944 was a momentous day in Iceland's history. On that day, Iceland became a republic. So remember, we assumed all sovereign powers from Denmark right after the Danish occupation in April 1940, And on the 17th of June, 1944, it is a long and complex story. I cannot go into the details. But on the 17th of June, we established our independent republic, formally severed all ties with Denmark. A glorious day. Well, it rained a bit. It happens to rain every now and then in Iceland. But tens and thousands of Icelanders gathered at Þingvellir parliamentary fields, celebrating this final glorious step on the road to full independence. What a glorious day this was. 17th of June, 1944. Around that time, here in Latvia, one oppressive power was being replaced by another. The Nazis were on the way out, only to be replaced with Soviet forces. So this is not a period of joy in Latvian history. Now, during or after the Second World War, Iceland never formally recognized the Soviet annexation of Latvia or the two other Baltic countries. Never a formal recognition of the annexation that took place in 1940 and was then reconfirmed after 1944. However, to all intents and purposes, the Icelanders had to and did accept the state of affairs that existed, the Soviet annexation of the three Baltic countries, and went pretty far towards accepting this annexation de jure, or legally. Let's take a few examples. In 1958, members of the Icelandic parliament, the Alþing, went on an official visit to, as they said and put it, the Soviet Republic of Latvia. Also in the 1950s, Iceland signed an extensive trade agreement with the Soviet Union. Again, a complex story. It involves fish. Many things in Icelandic history involve fish. We had extended our fishing limits. The British were unhappy. They said, we are not buying any more fish from you guys, and this was meant to be a ban that would severely hit us. But then in stepped the Soviets, and they said, we will buy all your fish. It was play, Cold War play. But this relieved us from reliance on the British market, so we made an extensive agreement with the Soviet Union. So the following decades, Iceland was the country in Western Europe with almost certainly per capita the largest number of Volgas and Moskviches and all the other Soviet cars we would import, Ladas at the end. And we would buy petrol from the Soviet Union and sell a significant part of our fishery products to the Soviet Union from 1953. And of course, which ports would we sail to? Yes, we would sail to Leningrad and Murmansk, but also to Daugavpils, to Riga, the Soviet ports. No problems with that. In 1978, I did mention the 1958 parliamentary visit. In 1978, the Icelandic ambassador in Moscow went on an official visit to the three Soviet republics, as he called it, the Soviet Republic of, or Estonian Soviet Republic, Latvian Soviet Republic, and Lithuanian Soviet Republic. And he said, it's just ridiculous not to recognize this state of affairs. It's going to continue forever. Let's just adjust to it and stop fooling around. Stop having these trade relations and not accepting the true state of affairs. So there was this sense of realpolitik, as it were. We have to accept this state of affairs. And let me quote you another thing. In 1966, Hungarian refugees issued an appeal to the Icelandic Prime Minister. Let's remember the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, the blood that was shed there, the Soviet invasion of 1956. Please, government of Iceland, announce that you condemn this atrocity and that you stand with us, free Hungarians in exile, something like this. And you can almost replace Latvians with Hungarians in this. And the Icelandic Prime Minister replied, and we have to understand his position. And he replied on these notes, the vast majority of the Icelandic people has, from the very outset, had the deepest feeling of sympathy for the struggle for freedom of the Hungarians. And just in your minds, replace Hungarians with Latvians, and for their fate. Iceland, on the other hand, is a small country and devoid of power. As a consequence, care has always been taken on the part of the Icelandic government not to mix in the affairs of others by the issuance of declarations or by some other means which could not be followed through. It would serve no one if this rule were to be broken now. So this is realpolitik. We have to face the situation as it is. Empty words will do nothing. But don't misunderstand me. There was always sympathy for the Baltic plight, for the oppression the people in the Baltic countries had to suffer. I remember as a child, I was fascinated with flags and atlases. I could recount. Mom or dad would say, "Where's this flag from?" And I would say, "Uruguay." Or "Where's this flag from?" And I would say, "Uganda," or something like that. I had it all in my mind. And I had these three flags, but they did not have states. The flags of Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. And it was curious in my mind. How come you had these flags, you had these states, and they are no longer there? Also, books were written and published and translated in Iceland about the Baltic plights, about the plight of the Baltic. So this is the situation in the 1980s, when things begin to change. In 1985, with Mikhail Gorbachev coming to power, and perestroika and glasnost, you can sense these fresh winds blowing. In 1986, we had the Reagan-Gorbachev summit in Reykjavik, and you could sense a feeling of change. And here in Latvia, in your neighboring countries, you could sense freedom in the air. Gradually, slowly but surely, people were given the voice to speak, and then they would not say, "Yes, we want to continue belonging to the Soviet Union. That is our greatest dream." No, we want to reclaim our freedom, our independence, our right to rule our own affairs. In 1989, it made headlines around the world, including Iceland, when people joined hands here from the northern coast of Estonia through Latvia to the southern border of Lithuania, protesting the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939. And this is the background to Iceland's support for Baltic independence in 1990 and 91. There is this growing support in Iceland for the Baltic case. This culminates in 1991. Let us go briefly to the dark days of January 1991. On the 13th of January, you have the attack on the TV tower in Vilnius in Lithuania. On the 14th of January, here in Riga, the special units of the Soviet Interior Ministry, the OMON, start attacking people. There are fatalities. Ultimately, 6 Latvians die. And this is the background to an appeal to leaders of the Western world. Are you just going to watch this and do nothing? Are you going to stand aside and do nothing? The foreign minister of Iceland at the time felt that he could not do that. He stated his wish to travel to the Baltic countries, to Latvia, to Lithuania, to Estonia. Hannibalsson was determined to do what he could do. Now, traveling to these countries in January 1991 poses some hurdles you have to cross. Where do you apply for a visa? Well, at the Soviet embassy in Reykjavik. Isn't this contradiction? That's what the Soviet official said. Okay, you claim you are supporting Baltic independence, yet you come to us to ask for a visa. And this actually prevented some other Western leaders from going. They felt that they could not go to the Baltic republics with a Soviet stamp in their passport. But Jón Baldvin Hannibalsson brushed this aside. I'm going to offer moral support. So he was here on the 20th of January 1991, when there were battles in the streets. Just hours after he left, if I remember correctly, there was a gunfight here in downtown Riga. He called on other Western leaders to step up, to increase their support for Baltic independence, arguing that the Cold War would never be over unless the Baltic states, the three Baltic states, were to reclaim their rightful place on the international scene. Nobody followed in the foreign minister's footsteps. No other Western foreign minister decided to visit the Baltic states. And when in February 1991, Iceland re-emphasized that it fully recognized the independence of Lithuania, which was at that time at the sort of forefront in the Baltic camp, no other country followed Iceland's lead. But that was always the aim. The aim was to break the ice, as it were. So you could argue that Icelandic policy did not matter that much, and I'll come to that briefly again. So nothing really changed in the immediate months following these atrocities here in Riga and in Vilnius in January 1991. But then, in August of that year, everything changed. With the putsch in Moscow, everything is in upheaval there. It starts on the 19th of August, and on the 21st of August, there is a NATO meeting in Brussels, a meeting of foreign ministers, and there, Hannibalsson sort of threw away his prepared speech and said, all right, it's now or never. It's a window of opportunity. And in this, he was fully supported by his Danish colleague, Uffe Ellemann-Jensen, and you could sort of say, almost tongue-in-cheek, that a certain race for recognition had begun. Who would be the first one? Who would be the first one to take the ultimate step of re-recognizing Baltic independence and re-establishing diplomatic relations? So if you had Hannibalsson and Uffe Ellemann-Jensen in the same room, you would not get an agreement on this. On the 22nd of August, Iceland announced that it fully recognized the three Baltic states and was ready to resume diplomatic relations with those three countries. So, on 26th of August, 1991, the foreign ministers of the three Baltic states, Jānis Jurkans here in Latvia, Algirdas Saudargas in Lithuania, and Lennart Meri in Estonia, flew over to Iceland to Höfði House, where Reagan and Gorbachev had met in 1986, 5 years before, and there was this glorious occasion, the re-establishment of diplomatic relations between Iceland and the three Baltic states. A very momentous occasion which, as I can testify, has gained its place in the memory of Latvians, Estonians, and Lithuanians. We Icelanders are almost embarrassed by the gratitude we feel when we visit the three Baltic countries. And of course, it is very nice. But do we deserve this gratitude? Did we make sure that the three Baltic countries regained their independence? Was it down to us primarily? In the summer of 1990, Hannibalsson, the foreign minister, had a discussion with a US official about this, and Hannibalsson and other Icelandic dignitaries, including the prime minister at the time, Davíð Oddsson, who incidentally had translated a book about the Baltic plight, about the Soviet oppression in the Baltics. Hannibalsson had a discussion with a US official about this. We have to go further towards supporting the Balts. And this US diplomat said, it's so great to represent a small country like Iceland. You can say whatever you want. Nobody takes effect. There. Was that the case? Or take geography. Now, don't get me wrong. I am not, let me repeat, I am not disparaging Finnish attitudes, for instance. But Finland was sometimes criticized in those years, 1990, 91, for being overcautious in its obvious support for Baltic independence, but advocating caution all the time. Why was this? The Finnish president, Mauno Koivisto, was asked this. Why were you so cautious? Why did you not go as far as Iceland, for instance? And Koivisto answered in his sort of strong Finnish accent. And let me also emphasize, we Icelanders also have very strong English accents. But Koivisto said, "We are not an island in the middle of the North Atlantic." And this mattered. It did matter for us that we were situated where we were. The Soviet Union was not going to attack us. I'm not saying they were going to attack Finland, but it matters where you stand. However, remember what I said about Soviet trade. This is what the Soviets implied in the 1990-91 period of history. They said, okay, are you really going this far in support of the Baltic countries? Then we have to reconsider all trade with you guys. But it was going down anyway. It was not a weapon that really mattered. So that was, of course, we would have suffered had the Soviets decided to cancel all trade. And the ironies of history and the essence of real politics still is that at the same time that Foreign Minister Hannibalsson was here in Riga and in Tallinn and in Vilnius to advocate Icelandic support for Baltic independence, there were Icelandic officials in Moscow at precisely the same moment signing an Icelandic-Soviet trade agreement. It also demonstrates the total inefficiency of the Soviet system at the time. One department had no idea what the other was doing. They would never have signed a trade agreement with us at the same time that we were declaring our full support for Baltic independence. In Iceland, at the Soviet embassy in Iceland, they were saying, if you support them, we will cut all trade. In Moscow, they were signing trade agreements while the foreign minister was in the Baltic countries. It was a true testimony to the total inefficiency of the Soviet system. So, we have the restoration of diplomatic relations on the 26th of August, 1991. Early September, the United States, well, should I say, follows Iceland's lead. The US re-recognizes, they never, of course, never formally accepted the occupation or the annexation, but they re-recognized the actual state of affairs and re-established diplomatic relations with the authorities in the three Baltic countries. And the US president at the time was asked, why did you take so long? Why are you among the last to take this step? And the then president replied, well, when history is written, nobody's going to remember that we took 48 hours more than Iceland or whoever else it was. This offended us, you know. And he had to backtrack. Next official visit of an Icelandic dignitary to Washington, D.C., he was asked about this comment, and he had to say, oh, I'm sorry, no disrespect to Iceland, but let's keep in mind the actual state of affairs. Let's keep in mind that we had to look at the Soviet Union and its disintegration. We wanted to be a peaceful process. We wanted to think about nuclear weapons and so on and so forth. And therefore, and you almost come back to, therefore, almost we had to forget the Balts. We had to forget the Baltic peoples. But, you know, you still, does he not have a case in point? When history is written, nobody's going to remember that it was Iceland or whoever else. Well, not in the Baltic countries. Let me assure you, we feel this gratitude every time we come here, and it is very gratifying, of course. But we have to ask ourselves objectively, did we secure Baltic independence? Did we cause Soviet collapse? Of course not. Of course not. It was up to you, the Latvians, and the Estonians, and the Lithuanians, to fight, even at the risk of lives, for independence and freedom. But we were able to help still. We were able to help. Did Icelandic support matter? And, we never directed decision-making in Washington, in Brussels, in London, in Bonn, Berlin, and certainly not in the Kremlin. There were never anxious moments in Moscow. Well, we just heard the latest news from Reykjavik. Never. But we did offer moral support, and that does count. It does count in a situation like this, that you have the feeling that you're not totally forgotten, that somebody's out there willing to say, yes, we support them. And that was our contribution. And there was also indirect pressure, not just from Iceland, but from Iceland, Denmark, Norway, Sweden and Finland also, and other countries, that you must not forget the Baltic countries. You cannot say that the Cold War is over until these 3 states have regained their independence. So that the next generation of children will not have to ask their parents, what are these flags? Where are the countries belonging to these flags? No, the Cold War wasn't over until you have reached this destination, full independence for the Baltic countries. So the lesson from all this, what is the lesson of all this? And you may ask, well, how does this president know all this? I am not this, even if I may say so, this knowledgeable about the history of countries I visit. It just so happens that I wrote my master's thesis in history on Icelandic support for Baltic independence, 1990-91. And I, unfortunately, you are students, some of you, we are poor, and grants do not cover everything. So in 1994, I was able to visit Tallinn and Vilnius. I could afford 2 trips. Unfortunately, not Riga. But then, of course, I felt this gratitude and was able to gather material for my thesis. And then I have worked as a historian. And as a historian, it is your duty and obligation to be totally independent and critical. Not think, what do the authorities want me to say? What is the best version for the government of Iceland? As head of state, you are in a slightly different position. It is your duty to be positive. It's written in your job description to be positive. Try to find things that unite you. And when you go on foreign visits, to emphasize that which unites us and a prosperous, bright future and so on and so forth. There were aspects of this story which sort of raise questions. We talk about Icelandic support for Baltic independence. The Baltic countries were not always united. The Lithuanians always wanted to go farther and faster than the Estonians and the Latvians. I remember the late Lennart Meri, president of Estonia later on, but then he was foreign minister, like I mentioned. I asked him about this, and he replied and smiled, well, we are not like our Catholic martyrs in the south. We are not so emotional. And maybe Latvia falls somewhere in between the stoic, reserved Estonians and the emotional Lithuanians. So, for instance, the Lithuanians would always call for the immediate recognition of Lithuanian independence and the establishment of diplomatic relations, whereas the Latvians and the Estonians, they would be more cautious and said, let's just take it slowly, more slowly. Also, there was some disunity in Iceland. There were some people who said, should we not look at Soviet trade? Should we risk Soviet trade for empty declarations? Should we not just do it the cautious way and just follow the US lead or the British lead, So, this is a complex story. But at the bottom, there is the final conclusion. We Icelanders, authorities, public at large, wanted to offer moral support, and it did have an effect. Not a direct effect, but an indirect feeling of we are not alone. And, like I mentioned, managing to also keep the issue alive in international forums. So, what now? Latvia regained its independence, became a member of the United Nations, later on joined NATO, where Iceland is also a member, became a member of the European Union. Iceland is not a member there. Latvia has achieved freedom, prosperity. There have also been setbacks. People have left the country, feeling that there are more opportunities elsewhere. And this poses, of course, challenges for the population at large and the political body. Again, we would like to help creating a better future for Latvia and Iceland. And how do we do that? By continuing to engage and to cooperate and to work together. And that's why a visit of this kind is so important. We managed to reconfirm the connection, the necessary and vital connection between our two small states. I say small states, but it's just a matter of how you feel. And Latvia is a strong, independent state. Iceland is a strong, independent state. We are small in population. There's only 350,000 or so Icelanders. It's me, my mother, my family. And you are slightly more populous, but that doesn't matter. We made it to the World Cup in Russia in men's football. You won Eurovision. We've never achieved that. It's a matter of feeling, and it is gratifying to feel here now as we celebrate 100th anniversary of Latvian independence that there are challenges, yes, economic problems, emigration, and other related issues which you know much better than I do. But the future is there for us to shape, and as we move on forward, I think it is vital that we also maintain our pride in history, in our nation, but a pride mixed with modesty. We Icelanders have enjoyed a bumpy road in recent years, economically, for instance. We felt we could conquer the world. Well, I'm exaggerating a bit, but that was the spirit of the times. We felt that whatever we touched turned into gold, and we suffered a huge economic crisis 10 years ago. We managed to survive and prosper. Iceland is in a healthier shape now, much healthier shape. And if there's anything we can learn from it, is that patriotism is fine, nationalism is fine, pride is fine, but let's mix it with some modesty as well. Let's be proud of our achievements, and especially as we look at the world around us, I think we need to be really careful of not giving in to the temptation of excessive nationalism. Our nationalism should be positive. It should be based on pride and love for your country and your people, but it should be inclusive. It should not be based on dislike or fear towards others. We should promote this positive patriotism. Patriotism of pride, but modesty as well. And we should emphasize the values and importance of independence, but also interdependence. If the story of small states tells us anything, it is that we cannot exist alone. We rely on the support and cooperation with others. We rely on international law, that international law be respected and adhered to. And we have common concerns. Yes, we are independent states with our own independent challenges and needs, but the tasks ahead, the challenges ahead are also global. Environmental concerns will not be solved by decisions in Riga or decisions in Reykjavik, but in joint forums. So that is why also a visit of this kind is important. We go look back, celebrate past achievements, look at past history, but look forward as well. And by doing that together, we are much more likely to secure for ourselves, our children and our grandchildren, a safe and prosperous future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. President, for inspiring and very positive speech. And do we have time for maybe some questions? So please, some 2-3 questions. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Mr. President, for an inspiring speech. I was deputy head of the Latvian Information Office in Stockholm. All these people that you mentioned, when the bloody days in January occurred, they all came to Stockholm to establish an exile government. We didn't want the same thing to happen in what happened in 1940 when the government stayed there. Daivin Sivans came, you all mentioned Jānis Jurkans, Leonard Meri, and Saudargas and so on. But you actually answered my question in your lecture, because I remember Mr. Zigarist, Emanuel Zigarist from Lithuania, running off to Iceland. He says, Atas, look, Iceland will recognize independence in January.
Yes.
I said, oh, really? Okay. But he never came back. I don't know what happened, But you said that Mr. Hannibalsson came to the Baltic states afterwards, and that must have been the result of that. But just one point, it wasn't 48 hours, the Americans.
Yes, exactly.
They waited until the 7th of September, 2 days before the Soviet Union recognized.
Exactly, that's what they said 48 hours, but it was a bit longer than that, even longer than that. And, it gives us a sort of perverse pride that, at least he said, Iceland, he remembered Iceland was there somewhere. It wasn't Denmark, for instance. But you mentioned Singaris, and these days were so full of excitement. And I told you I'm a historian, and I was working as a professor of history. And it's just one of these things that, unfortunately, I had to put aside when I had this change in my life and career. But one day I'm going to write the history of this, and it is such a dramatic tale. Landsbergis in Lithuania, he called up the Icelandic foreign minister through Leon Bott in Oslo, and the message was simply like, if you've meant anything with your words, you must come to Vilnius right now. We are being attacked. And this is such a momentous decision. And sometimes, like we Icelanders, we are, I wouldn't say luckiest people on earth, but our history, our 20th century history, does not include the dramatic events, the horrific periods that you have had here in Latvia, and gives us a sense of perspective. I remember at one conference when I was talking about Icelandic support for Baltic independence, and I spoke with with a colleague from Estonia, and I asked him, where were you in January and August 1991? And he said, well, born in 83, he said, I was 8, and I was with my grandfather, and my grandfather said, pack your rucksack, it's going to be like 1940. That was the feeling. And this is so alien to us, of course.
Thank you. Some more questions, please. If no more questions, before you leave, Mr. President, we would like to invite you to sign in our guest book of university.
Thank you very much. That's an honor. to visit Iceland?
Thank you. Once again, thank you, Your Excellency, for this great opportunity to meet and hear you personally, and we wish you a real celebration atmosphere here in Riga. Enjoy your stay in Latvia, and we wish you all the best.